So in this video, I'm going to show you how to tackle the teacher and book question. And we're going to again build this from the question through to the pseudocode through to the final Python version, although obviously the pseudocode is what you get marked for in the exam. Okay, so let's see if we can break this down. And again, we're going to try and go for input, process and output, and again I'm going to try and highlight them in different colors just so you can see where things are. So as always with these questions, they'll give you a bit of description, what the algorithm has to do. They also always give you the option of pseudocode or drawing a flowchart, whichever way works for you. If you are doing a flowchart, just remember that you need to show the direction of the arrows very clearly in order to get the marks as well. But some people I know will find the flowcharts a lot easier than the pseudocode. So let's start with the input. So the algorithm must ask the teacher how many pages the book has and store this in an appropriately named variable. Well, there's a couple of things to watch out for here. This is definitely going to be our input section, so let's highlight that. And I'm going to put that into blue. And it's going to ask how many pages the book has, so there's a little bit of prodding the user for something, but then it's also got a storage bit. So in this case, this algorithm has got some of the sort of niceties that you might expect in a program. The other thing it says is an appropriately named variable. I'm actually going to highlight that because that basically tells us that we're going to get a mark for naming the variable in a way that makes it understandable. One thing to watch out for is that they could have used the word identifier here rather than variable. They both mean the same thing. But again, we're going to get a mark for getting that named in a way that makes it easy for the other people to understand it. So we don't want to call it X, we don't want to call it Y. Okay. So the next bit is to look at this middle bullet point, and it talks about for every page in the book the algorithm should. So in other words, that looks like a process bit. So that's something that's going to have to go through every single page. That sounds to me very much like a loop. And it then goes on and says, ask the teacher if the page looks easy or difficult. Well, that actually is some input. So actually, we've got some processing followed by some input, and that's nothing wrong with that. It's just a little bit different from some of the other algorithms we've seen. So in the next part of the algorithm, it's going to make some decisions. If a page is difficult, it increases the total number of seconds by 100. If the page is easy, then the total number of seconds should increase by 40. And notice this is the first time it's mentioned seconds. Yes, it tells you here about how long, but it's the first time it's mentioned this potential variable here. So that's something we need to watch out for. Now this bit here is pure processing. It's simply making a decision between two things. So let's identify that as processing. After the teacher has entered the difficulty level for all the pages, the algorithm should output the estimated number of seconds that it should take to read the book. So in other words, what we've got here is we've got our output section here, and I'm going to put that into red. So there's our algorithm highlighted with the different parts of it: input, processing, output. And we've got this situation where we've got a little bit of input inside our actual processing, and nothing wrong with that. It's just a bit different from what you've seen before. So let's start to build this in pseudocode. So inbuilt into this algorithm, as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of prettiness, a little bit of prompting. Again, most of the questions you'll see in the exam don't have this kind of thing. They just ask, say, store this, or get this from the user and store it. Here they're specifically asking you for something that might be a little bit prettier, and that will probably get you a mark. So we're going to print and ask the user to enter the number of pages. We then want to store that, and remembering that we're going to get a mark for appropriately named variable. So let's go input. And there's my mark there already. So now, let's say that you are going to struggle with the middle bit and you're in the exam, you're under pressure, you're not quite sure how to handle the middle bit, but you want to squeeze the maximum marks out. Well, the easiest way to do that would be to actually give yourself some space, and down here we're going to do the output, because the output is just the total number of seconds. And that actually gives us some points, because in the exam it marks it line by line, bit by bit of the algorithm. So our next bit is to handle the processing, and it wants us to do the processing for every page in the book. Now that means that we've got to have a loop, and there's a couple of options here. We could use a while loop, we could use a for loop. In this case I'm going to use a for loop. It doesn't really matter if you've got a different way of doing this, that's absolutely fine, but let's start with a for loop. And I need to have a loop variable. And one thing to remember with loops is you want to be able to finish them in pseudocode. So I'm just going to make sure that I do that. Here we are. And it doesn't matter whether you go for, next for, or end for. There's lots of ways of doing this, okay? Whichever way you structure it, as long as it's clear, will be fine. Okay, so our next little bit is it says, ask the teacher if the page looks easy or difficult. Now one thing to remember about this is because we're in a for loop, we need to tab in a little bit. So we're going to go print, is the page easy or difficult? We're then going to store that in a variable. So that's our second piece of input done. What we now need to do is handle the if statement. If a page is difficult, then the total number of seconds should increase by 100. So if don't forget to close off the if statement here. And I can do a very similar sort of thing for the easy bit. So if difficulty equals easy, then total seconds finish off my end if. I'm just going to tighten that up a little bit so you can see the whole thing. Remember that this bit here, these things mean assign the right hand side to the left hand variable. So take all of this and store it in here. Doesn't make much sense from a purely mathematical point of view, but it does make total sense from a programming point of view. So there's our algorithm. So what we need to do now is we need to take that algorithm and turn it into actual code. So here we are, ready to do the code. And again, what I've done is I've broken this down into the input, process, and output. We've got process and more input in the same place. And I've also got an initialize bit here as well, which we talked about in previous videos. So I'm going to start with initialize, and this again is optional in Python, but I think it is a good programming practice to make sure that you know what variables you're going to use, you make sure that the program knows what variables you're going to use, what types of variables they are. So our first one is no of pages. Let's set that to 0. Our other variable is difficulty. Now, whereas no of pages is an integer variable, difficulty is a string. It's got characters in it. It's a set of characters, so it's a string. So I'm going to make that an empty string. And finally, I've got one other variable, total seconds, which I'm going to set to 0. Okay, let's handle the input bit. So we can take the 2 lines of sudo and turn that into 1 line. So no of pages. This is an integer variable, so we need to change it into an integer when it comes in. So input fantastic. So that's that little bit done. We can pull up a little bit more here so it gives us a bit more space. So what we now need to do is handle the processing element, and we're going to start off with the for loop. And there's a tricky little thing to watch out for with for loops in Python, and it's that they do this, and this is quite strange. With a for loop in Python starts at wherever you want it to start from, let's say e.g. 1, but let's say it then ends at your final number but -1. So in other words, if you do a for loop that goes for 1 to 10, it's actually going to go for 1 to 9. So you've just got to watch out for that a little bit. There are very good reasons for Python doing that. Other languages do it as well, but it just needs to be a little bit careful about the way you handle these loops. So you're going to see that in a second with this. So for loop in range, I'm going to start at the first page, and I'm going to go on to the last page. So be a bit careful here with the for loop. Yes, it starts at 1, but let's say the book had 300 pages in it. The for loop will stop at 299. So what we actually need to do is add 1 to this just to force it to go to the whole number of pages rather than the number of pages -1. It's an awkward bit. If you're not sure, have another look at for loops in your programming exercises. Okay, so we've now got to handle a little bit more input. So this is the difficulty. Because this is a string, I don't need to worry about changing it into an integer. So there's my difficulty. Because it's a string, I didn't need to worry about changing it into an integer. What I've now got to do is handle my if statement. So if difficulty, and be careful again here with Python, is equal to difficult. And we haven't got a then in Python, but we do have a colon. Total seconds becomes total seconds plus 100. If you're feeling cunning like I am, you could do a little bit of copy and paste here. It's up to you. And we can change this to easy. Change that to 40, and we know that that's structured correctly. We don't have an endif here. We don't have n next for. We don't need to worry about that in Python. It's a nicety from pseudocode. Some languages do have it, but Python doesn't. Finally, what we need to do is output the final results. And here I've made it a bit prettier than it is in pseudocode. That's absolutely fine, whichever way I want to do it. In a program, you're probably better off making it pretty. In pseudocode, you don't have to. So here I am ready to run this script. I'm just going to press run, just check if there's any errors. Looks like it's okay so far. I'm going to add 4 pages in just so it's a short test. Let's start off with 2 easies and then 2 difficult. And when you're testing this, just make sure you type in the information exactly as you put it into the program, because otherwise it won't understand what you're talking about. And what we've got there is 280. So let's just check that we've got our result correct. So we've got 280 there. So that's going to be 2 easy pages. That's 40 plus 40. And then it's going to be 2 difficult pages. So that's 100 plus 100, 280. So that's perfect. And that's working great. Notice you can use Python straight as a calculator. So let's go for a little review of the question in the pseudocode. So here are the exam question and the exam answer side by side. And notice the way that I've broken this down into input, process and output. Notice that you've got a for loop in there from loop 1 to number of pages. And notice that there is some input inside the actual processing. So what I'd like to do is to have a little review of the Python code and the way that relates to the pseudocode. The main thing I want to point out is the for loop, because in Python, for loops start at the bottom, so in this case they start at 1, that's perfectly okay, but then they go up to the end number -1. So that's why here we've got number of pages plus 1, so that if the number of pages is 300, it doesn't do the loop from 1 to 299. And that's the main thing that I just want to handle and make sure you understand.